The story of Florence Welch begins not on a glamorous stage, but in the smoky, dimly lit corners of South London pubs in the mid-2000s. There, a girl with vividly red hair and a voice that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards stood as a living, breathing contradiction. She was a creature of maximalist dreams, living in a world that insisted on being small, while her peers were chasing the polished, minimalist trends of the era. Florence was screaming into the void, her voice a thunderous instrument that felt far too large for the cramped, sticky stages of Camberwell. She felt like an alien in her own skin, a displaced spirit searching for a frequency that did not yet exist in the mainstream airwaves. She was not just a singer, she was a storm waiting for a map. This was a young woman who navigated her daily life through the challenging, often disorienting haze of dyslexia and dyspraxia. For Florence, the world was a sensory overload where words on a page often shuffled like deck chairs on a sinking ship, and physical grace was a foreign concept she could never quite master. To the outside world, she might have seemed disorganized, eccentric, or perpetually lost, but inside her mind she was building a massive, intricate cathedral of sound. She was a maximalist soul trapped in a minimalist reality, struggling with a feeling of perpetual displacement. For Florence, music was never a simple career choice. It was a vital survival mechanism, a way to translate the chaotic, beautiful architecture of her mind into something the rest of the world could finally feel. Despite the undeniable power of her lungs, an internal battle raged constantly within her. Every time she stepped toward a microphone in those early days, she was met with a paralyzing, suffocating stage fright that threatened to choke the very song she needed to release. It was a cruel irony. She possessed a message that could shatter glass and move mountains, yet she was terrified of the very people who needed to hear it. Her primary motivation was not the pursuit of fame or fortune, but a driving need to transform her perceived weirdness into a sanctuary. She wanted to create a space where her eccentricities were not flaws, but the foundational pillars of a new magical world. The turning point of her life arrived in the most unglamorous of settings, a club bathroom. It was there that Florence cornered Marie Nash, a woman with the professional influence to change her trajectory forever. In a moment of pure, unadulterated audacity, Florence began to sing Etta James at the top of her lungs, her voice bouncing off the cold tiled walls with a force that left no room for doubt. It was not a polite audition, it was a sonic assault of pure talent. Marie Nash did not just hear a girl singing, she heard a force of nature that refused to be ignored. That bathroom encounter became the spark that ignited a revolution, a legendary meeting that proved Florence's voice was far too big to be contained by the boundaries of a restroom or the expectations of South London. Out of this burgeoning professional partnership, a unique identity began to crystallize. Almost by accident, the name Florence plus the Machine started as a joke, a playful nod to her collaboration with Isabella Summers, but it quickly evolved into something far more significant. The Machine became a shield, a larger-than-life persona that Florence could step into when the real world became too overwhelming. It was a gothic romantic armor that allowed the fragile, anxious girl from London to transform into a shamanic priestess of sound. This was not just a band name, it was a sanctuary she had built to house her power. As the decade closed, Florence rejected the leather jackets and minimalist guitar riffs of Britpop in favor of harps, choirs, and a haunting gothic romanticism. Her music was a tapestry of myth and folklore, weaving together stories of cosmic longing. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, as her debut album Lungs began its meteoric climb up the charts. The weight of her new identity started to press down. The Machine was becoming a gargantuan entity that demanded more than she was ready to give. As the spotlight intensified, the pressure of the world's gaze threatened to shatter the fragile girl behind the curtain. Dog Days Are Over was more than just a hit. It was a cultural explosion that propelled Florence from a quirky London eccentric into a global shamanic figure. On stage, she became a whirlwind of copper hair and flowing chiffon, leaping into the air as if she could catch the spirit of the music in her bare hands. To the millions watching, she was a divine creature, a pagan goddess who had descended from some ancient misty forest to lead them in a communal exorcism of their sorrows. She commanded the stage with a primal, raw energy that seemed inexhaustible, her feet bare against the wood, her hands reaching for something unseen and holy. But as the venues grew from smoky clubs to echoing massive arenas, the ethereal goddess persona began to exert a heavy, invisible toll. The gap between the girl who still felt like a clumsy, displaced alien, and the shimmering icon on the posters began to widen into a dangerous, terrifying chasm. This period, centered around the creation and touring of the album's ceremonials, marked the emergence of Florence's shadow side. The music became grander, more operatic, and steeped in a wall of sound that was as much a defensive fortification as it was an artistic choice. She layered harps, choirs, and thunderous drums until the noise was thick enough to drown out the persistent, whispering anxieties that haunted the quiet corners of her mind. It was a time of glorious gothic excess. But beneath the layers of heavy velvet and gold jewelry, her internal self-destructive tendencies were rapidly gaining ground. To survive the crushing weight of public expectation and the terrifying raw intimacy of the spotlight, Florence turned to the chaotic, numbing power of alcohol. The parties became wilder, the nights grew longer, and the line between a celebratory toast and a desperate, lonely escape blurred into a dark haze of gin and late-night London streets. Fame, she quickly realized, was not a cure for her inherent loneliness. It was a cruel magnifying glass. Even as she was surrounded by thousands of screaming, adoring fans, Florence felt a profound sense of isolation. She described her existence during these world tours as ghost-haunted, a series of liminal, hollow spaces, hotel rooms, dressing rooms, and airport lounges, where the real world felt increasingly thin and unreachable. The girl who had built a machine to protect her fragile heart now found that the machine was running her, demanding a performance of manic joy and supernatural power even when her own heart felt like heavy lead. She was a passive passenger in her own life, watching the high-speed, dizzying blur of her career through a thick fog of physical exhaustion and spiritual hunger. The very identity she had painstakingly constructed for her own survival was now the gilded cage she lived in every single day. The physical climax of this internal conflict arrived with a terrifying, sudden finality. During a world tour that seemed never-ending, the instrument she had relied on since those early, desperate pub days, her voice began to fail. It was not just a hoarse throat or a passing cold, it was a total systemic breakdown of her physical self. The lifestyle fueled by her unique identity, the constant traveling, the heavy drinking, and the relentless emotional upheaval was physically destroying the very thing that made her Florence. There were nights when the high notes felt like jagged shards of glass in her throat, and the fear of a silent future became a paralyzing reality. Her body was screaming for a rest that her schedule would not allow, and the shamanic priestess was beginning to crumble under the weight of her own myth. This was the ultimate betrayal of self. Florence felt she was playing a character she had outgrown. The ethereal goddess had become a caricature. Then, without warning, the noise stopped. The machine was powered down. Florence retreated into silence, leaving fans wondering if the flame had burned out and if she was broken beyond repair. The silence that followed her sudden retreat was not an end, but a necessary shedding of skin. The period she would later call the Year of Chaos became a crucible, burning away the layers of artifice she had relied upon for survival. She stopped hiding behind the thunder of the drums and the celestial harps that had once defined her sonic landscape. With the album How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful, Florence chose a path of radical exposure. She stripped away the elaborate metaphors of drowning and the makeup that had served as her war paint. She was no longer an ocean, a ghost, or a pagan goddess. She was a woman standing in the harsh afternoon sun, grappling with the messy reality of a broken heart and a life that had spiraled out of her control. The machine was no longer a shield used to hide her fragility, but a refined tool to amplify her newfound honesty. This was the redemptive shift, the pivotal moment where the maximalist soul finally learned the power of the raw truth. The climax of this era arrived on a humid night at the 2015 Glastonbury Festival. When the Foo Fighters were forced to withdraw, Florence was thrust into the headlining slot, a position reserved for rock titans. It was a high-stakes moment that would decide her career's fate. Could the eccentric girl from South London command the largest stage in the world without the safety net of her polished persona? On that night, barefoot and dressed in a simple silver suit, she didn't just perform, she transcended. Without the bells and whistles of her earlier theatricality, she proved that her identity was valid and potent. She ran through the crowd like a joyful spirit, her copper hair a banner of defiance against the dark. She led the crowd in a communal roar that echoed across the hills, proving she didn't need the alcohol or the artifice to be the most captivating presence in music. It was a victory of human connection over pure spectacle. This professional triumph mirrored a profound internal transformation as Florence embraced sobriety. She moved away from her self-destructive cycles and discovered a new form of sober magic. The chaotic girl who once felt she needed a bottle of gin to face the terrifying intimacy of the world found that her vulnerability was her ultimate superpower. By finally integrating the fragile person with the powerful shamanic performer, she finalized her musical identity. She stopped running from her own shadow and started building a life based on clarity and intentionality. This shift allowed her to evolve from a chaotic starlet into a respected cultural icon. Her subsequent works, such as High as Hope and Dance Fever, showcased a mature artist who could weave together high poetry, pre-Raphaelite aesthetics, and modern performance art. She became a storyteller of the soul, exploring personal themes of family, aging, and the primal need to dance through the fire. Ultimately, Florence Welch's journey was about more than just her own survival. It was about the legacy she left for those who would follow. She paved a golden path for a new generation of artists, making the industry a safer place for the unconventional. Without the trail blazed by her fearless maximalism, the landscape that allowed for the rise of artists like Lorde or Billie Eilish might never have materialized. She made it possible for the weird girl to be the most powerful person in the room, proving that eccentricity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a weapon to be wielded with pride. Florence finally found a lasting peace with her machine, realizing that it wasn't a mask she had built to hide her true self, but a cathedral she grew into to survive. Her story ends with an invitation. She built a sacred sanctuary, a Gothic cathedral where every misplaced soul can finally find their voice.